Okay, let's start. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the Kristallnacht Memorial Event of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. I'm delighted to have an excellent event with distinguished scholars with us tonight. Let me say just a few words before we begin. We are going to discuss Angelika Bammer's book, Born After, Reckoning with the German Past. Maybe I can show you the book here, which is a moving, wonderfully written and thoughtful meditation about growing up in Germany after the Second World War. Angelika is professor of comparative literature and interdisciplinary humanities at Emory University. She is the author of, among others, The Future of Scholarly Writing, Critical Interventions, and of course, the book that we are here to discuss. Two distinguished scholars will speak about the book, and then Angelika will respond. Then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. Aleida Assmann is Professor of English and Literary Studies Emerita at the University of Constance in Germany. Her work is focused on cultural anthropology and cultural and communicative memory. Roger Free is Professor of Education at Simon Fraser University and Affiliate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. He's the author most recently of the award-winning book, Not in My Family, German Memory and Responsibility After the Holocaust, published in 2017. Luckily for me, we have three distinguished scholars, so I don't need to speak a lot when I introduce them. We all know them and have read their work. Angelika will start with a few words framing the book. After the papers, we are going to have a Q&A. Please write your questions at the bottom. There is a tab, Q&A, and I will then monitor the discussion. I want to remind you that this event is recorded, and you can find the recording then on the YouTube channel of the Institute and also on the website of the Institute. Please check our fall program. And I want also to remind us of next week's event in the Encounters program, which is a program that this Institute, together with the Harman Institute for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University, directed by Amos Goldberg, are doing together a few events every semester. Next week, we are going to discuss anti-Semitism. We're going to discuss a new book co-edited by three scholars. Let me tell you. By Scott Uri, Saul Goldberg, and Kalman Weiser, and the discussant will be Professor Stephanie Schuler-Springroom from the Center for Anti-Semitism in Berlin. So a worthy event. I think that's it. Angelika, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So let me begin by thanking you, Alon, and the Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies for inviting me and proposing a discussion of my book as the focus of this year's Kristallnacht Memorial Event. I am touched and deeply honored by this invitation. I'm equally honored that Roger Free and Aleida Assmann, two scholars whose work has been an inspiration and a guide to me for years, so readily and generously agreed to join me for this panel discussion. Thank you both. And finally, although he's invisible right now on the screen, I want to thank Paz Goldstein for handling the logistics of this event so graciously and efficiently. Thank you, Paz. My book asks a basic question. What do we do about the past? In particular, what do we do with the legacy of a past that we inherited, but neither caused nor suffered? How do we respond to traumatic histories whose legacy we live with, even though we didn't suffer the trauma directly or participate in causing the harm? These were the questions that shadowed my life from before I even knew the history in question and simply felt its residual effects. But as the daughter of German parents born after the war, I knew, long before I knew the facts, I knew the history of Nazi Germany and the genocide committed in the name of Germans, not as a history, but as a feeling. And I knew that being German in the eyes of the world was shameful, indelibly tainted by the memory of a criminal past. After carrying this identity, or perhaps I should say identification with me from childhood on, I finally decided as an adult that it was time to face it. What did this past I'd inherited mean to me? How did it shape how I lived my life, the nature of my relationships, my feelings about family, my sense of belonging in the world, my sense of legitimacy? My work on Born After became a process of working through, and I use that term in the psychoanalytic sense, some of these questions. It involved encountering and working through stifled feelings, truncated memories, and silenced knowledges in which past and present had gotten tangled up. It involved a process of writing and rewriting again. And in that process, I attempted to do the work of untangling. The work of the book is done. It is finished, it is out in the world, but the working through process continues. It has merely shifted. It has shifted from an internal process, a kind of dialogue with myself, to become an external process, putting me in dialogue, in exchange with others. In that sense, the reckoning that my title describes, Reckoning with the German Past, has become a different kind of reckoning. It has become a reckoning in relation to others and their response to the story I tell, the way I tell it, and the history as I tell it from my perspective. Sometimes this reckoning expands to include the history, people I speak with, people I engage in conversation with, have themselves been tangled up in. Sometimes these dialogues open doors to rooms we have never entered. Sometimes we discover rooms we didn't know were there. And sometimes we discover that some of these rooms harbor monsters. But as we know from ancient tales, or more recently, Maurice Sendak, not all monsters are evil. Not all monsters do harm. You can talk to them. I'm here. I see you. Come talk with me. And I thought I would read a passage from the book that describes such a moment of encounter between my father and me and the monsters we encountered in that space together. So briefly, the context, it was in the late 1990s. My father was at that time in his mid 80s. I had just come from Berlin, where I'd gone to see a recently installed Holocaust memorial, the so-called Track 17 Memorial, in the suburban train station of Berlin-Grunewald. It's a train station from which thousands of Berlin Jews had been deported, starting on October 18th, 1941. Before returning back to Atlanta, I stopped in Bonn to see my father. My mother was already dead by that point, and my father was living alone in a retirement community. So this is where my passage picks up. So, so I'm visiting my father. We were lingering after a late afternoon coffee. He was on the couch and I was in the chair across from him. In the waning light, he had become a silhouette against the window, and I couldn't see his features anymore. Perhaps the fact that his face was obscured from view like a person on television when their identity has to be hidden would enable me to speak more freely. He took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. He seemed tired, and I felt sluggish myself, but there were things I'd been waiting to say to him, and this seemed a good time. I drained my coffee and tried to focus. The last thing I recalled him saying had to do with trains. We spent a lot of time on trains, he had said, your mother and I. She would come where I was. I would go where she was. Whenever we could, we would be together. It was the trains that I wanted to get back to. How did that work? I asked. All those trips on trains. How could you travel around like that with everything else that was going on? My questions crumbled as I stumbled over words I avoided using around him. Deportation felt too blunt, too aggressive. The indirect vagueness of everything else that was going on felt more safe. Over a lifetime of practice, I had perfected the art of communicating indirectly. Yet he ignored the indirection and took my question literally. As a soldier, he said, he could travel anytime, anywhere, no ticket needed, just a soldier's pass. I could take any train I wanted. My uniform gave me the right. That wasn't what I'd meant to ask about. It wasn't what I wanted to know. What I wanted to know was, what did you see? What did you hear? What did you do? At a time when German newspapers carried headlines like, "The Jew is being exterminated," how did you live with that fact? Yet I didn't know how to ask these questions. The rule of silence is a hard rule to break. I swallowed and tried again. Were the trains that you took to see Ursula the same trains that carried troops to the front? Another deflection. Why am I talking about troops when I'm thinking about deportations? Why can't I get the right words out? My lack of courage felt shameful. I took a deep breath and plunged into the vortex I'd been avoiding. Were the trains that you and my mother took ever the same trains that deported Jews? It was as if a dam had been broken. The words I'd been holding back poured out. Did you ever see any trains like that? Did they stop at the same station where you stopped? What did they look like? Were they marked? What did you see? I felt dizzy and literally breathless. My father waited for me to finish, but I wasn't finished yet. What did you know? I blurted out. It was the question I'd lacked the courage to ask earlier. I sounded hoarse and my voice was scratchy. What did you know about the Holocaust at the time? I looked at him. He averted his eyes and his answer was another evasion. I was lucky, he said incongruously. The war took me out of all that. It took me out of what was happening in Germany. I waited. He said nothing more. The word lucky rang in my ears. I felt completely drained and exhausted. The little courage I had earlier had been spent. I had neither the energy nor the will to continue talking. We were done, at least for that evening. The room was in darkness, and my father was just a shape I could barely see. I wanted light and got up to turn the lamp on. Just about time for the evening news, my father said, and I handed him the remote. Okay, leave it at that.
Laida, you are muted.
Well, thank you so much, Angelika, for this passage, which looms large now in the rooms in which your voice, into which your voice reaches. I also would love to thank you, Alon, for inviting me to this group, and also for pointing this book out to me and making me read it. And thank you, Angelika, for having written it, because I spent a lot of time with it, and these are very good hours, very filled and rewarding hours. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful, wonderful achievement, and here are a few comments that I'm happy to contribute. I'll start with a quote from the year 1946, and it's Ilse Eichinger writing to her sister, and she writes, "Sometimes I think it is necessary to learn to keep silent before speaking." This perhaps was a message that Celan tried to, in vain, tried to convey to the literary group 47. Because there are two walls of silence, as Dan Baron told us. First of all, the traumatic silence of the victims, and then the leaden and complicit silence of the perpetrators. The leaden wall of silence started to get cracks in the 1980s. And now, after another 40 years, Angelika's book appears, in which she again pierces the silence of post-war Germany in which we grow up. We, and this is Angelika and me. Born After creates a portrait of a specific historical generation. It is the German equivalent for what in families of Jewish Holocaust survivors is called 2G, short for second generation or post-memory. Terms that refer to the unconscious transfer of the experience of the parents to their children. These children are convinced that nothing in their own lives can ever aspire to the impact and relevance connected with the lives of their parents. And this is also Angelika's crucial question. How do you remember things you didn't experience that happened to others before you were born? She wants to know everything about the lives of her parents and what they knew, or rather did not know, about the ongoing persecution and extermination of their fellow citizens who happened to be Jews. Here are two post-war German biographies. And because for me, Angelika's text is a kind of mirror that prompts me also in a very personal way to reflect my own backstory. Here are some similarities and differences. I was also born shortly after the end of the war and grew up in the Western German milieu of silence. Though this was not exactly the milieu of my family, and here also the word Jew did not disappear altogether because my parents stayed in contact after the war with their Jewish friends who had made it into emigration. While Angelika went to a Catholic boarding school, I attended a Protestant boarding school at Heidelberg, though as an external student. My school was founded by Elisabeth von Tadden, a resistor who was assassinated by the Nazis on the 20th of July in 1944. And this is really striking. We both studied at Heidelberg in 1966. And we both belong to the 68th generation. But I did not join the street movement and instead opted for a very bourgeois lifestyle because I married in the year 1968. Another point, when Angelika decided to leave Germany for the United States in 1969, I left Germany for Upper Egypt, for the desert and for a term to excavate ancient Egyptian tombs. I had already probed a foreign identity myself and perspective in the year 1963 and 64 that I spent as a student at an American high school. Another point, while Angelika acquired a new identity after her immigration to the United States and later formed strong alliances and co-taught with her Jewish colleagues, I had the great luck to form such an alliance with my teacher, Jeffrey Hartman, who visited Heidelberg annually since the 1970s and 80s. And with whom I had a chance then later on also to teach at Yale University, where he had founded the Fortunoff Archive of Holocaust Testimonies. And the last point, when Angelika in 2012 started her project of breaking the silence with her unique memoir, which is written in English, I had been involved since the 1980s in the long and very slow process of doing something to establish the institutional frames of what is today called German memory culture. In Angelika's book, I learned about a German generation that I had had no idea of. The millions of members of the 68th generation who immigrated into the United States, leaving home and family to get rid of their German identity. In doing so, she left the country behind, but not its past. On the contrary, the geographical distance and American context seem to have helped her even eventually to acquire a new perspective for her complicated relationship to German history and her family past. Angelika's amazing first attempt at reckoning with the German past as a young schoolgirl resulted in an ambitious and highly abstract report on the final solution in terms of facts and numbers. Her second attempt is the book that we are discussing tonight. The structure she created for it helps her to confront and to connect the intimate family memory with the larger history of the extermination of Jewish life in Germany and Europe. In various constellations, she spells out explicitly what was ignored in Germany. Her parents' love letters and travels, for instance, don't contain any evidence of the contemporary deportation trains carrying Jews eastwards to their lethal destinations. Or she discovers that Leitmeritz, a place where her father lived in his youth, is very close to Theresienstadt, a place name that never came up in their family conversations. By bringing the history of the exclusion of German Jews as closely as possible to incidents of her parents' lives, she forces herself and us to witness in retrospect what they had not wanted to see at their time. Angelika's book is a remarkable way of restaging scenes in hindsight that had gone unnoticed in her parents' lifetime. She's there is also a strong Catholic undercurrent in her book, connecting memory work with terms like original sin, penance, or vicarious expiation. I would like to call her stance that of the empathic witness, a new speaking position that W.G. Sebald introduced into German literature 20 years ago. This stance also can be connected with another term that I learned from Jeffrey Hartman, and that is secondary witness. Secondary witnessing is exactly what keeps Holocaust memory alive. I'm fascinated to see how time and again in Angelika's book, the labor of reckoning gives way to the labor of detailed recording. The most moving pages for me are the detailed accounts in which abstract names are invested with detailed information that transform them into memorable individuals. The special charisma of her book lies in its steady focus on individual lives and deaths and the unwavering attention that is supported by an enduring empathy. She brings back from oblivion her mother's schoolmates, Inge Saul and Ursula Mayer, and she tells the story of the last Jews in Wehlen in such a way that we learn much about the lives and last days of other last German Jews in many a German village. Angelika does not only combine personal remembering with historical reconstruction, but also historical reconstruction merges with public commemoration, as I'm reading the book right now and we are discussing it tonight. Reading her book today, many of its episodes blend with present local commemoration events that cluster right now here in Germany in October, November, recalling, for instance, the deportation of Konstanz Jews to Gürs from the Petershausener Bahnhof from October 1940 onwards, including right now the dedication of a new monument there 81 years after the events. So the track 17 that you introduced tonight is in Grunewald is a process that is continuing. This story, Born After and those born after, are marking other places. The community is participating in it, and there is a story that continues. Here, and I want to end with this, inheriting a legacy is the motto you just gave us. And here in this respect, I would like to connect your personal memory work with another one that appeared in the same year. The book is written by Burak Yilmaz, a Turkish German, and its title is A Matter of Honor, Fighting Anti-Semitism. He was born in 1986 in Germany as the grandchild of a Turkish migrant family and went to a Catholic gymnasium. At the time when Angelika embarked on her project, he started to lead groups of Turkish immigrants to trips to Auschwitz. More recently, he created theater performances as a medium for social and political education. While Angelika cut the bond to German citizenhood, Burak engaged and reckoned with the German past as a Turkish German. One way of adopting the German past for him was a careful research of local history. He grew up in a Turkish ghetto in Marxloh, a district of Duisburg, that had been inhabited by Jews in the 1930s. He reconstructed the names and stories of the Jews of his neighborhood in the same way that Angelika reconstructed the stories of the last Jews of Wehlen. He collected photographs that he showed around to the people that now live in the district. "Mama, this is our shop," said the daughter of a merchant who now runs a successful business with fancy Turkish bridal robes. Like Angelika, Burak uncovered the layered local history in which Jews were replaced by German Nazis and now by Turkish migrants. He recognizes the difference of times, but he also emphasizes the identity of the place and the continuity of the history from which he draws the obligation to adopt and to pass on this chapter of German history to his Turkish German community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aleida. Roger.
Thank you. I want to thank Alon for the kind invitation, and I want to say what an absolute pleasure it is for me to be able to speak to Angelika Bammer's important book and to share in discussion with Angelika and Aleida Assmann, whose work I have likewise long admired. But perhaps before starting, I should say that I'm living in Berlin at the moment, in Wilmersdorf, and this morning I went on a walk as I often do in the mornings, and there are hundreds of stumbling stones in my immediate neighborhood. And what was very moving was that early in the morning, people had put out flowers beside many of the stumbling stones, and it made me think of our talk this evening about memory work, but it also raised questions about what memory work consists of, whether the laying of a flower is related to, similar to the asking of the difficult questions of one's own German family, and how we navigate these different levels of remembering. Angelika's book addresses a dark and painful history in ways that are once deeply reflective, insightful, and often touching. Her book draws on a wealth of experience as someone who has worked across disciplines and has contended with the shadows of German history, both in her personal life and in her scholarship. Angelika's book is of enormous relevance, not only for how we address the Nazi past, but also for how we contend with the hateful present. In sharing my comments today, I will draw on my work as a historian and a psychoanalyst, but perhaps above all on my own German family history, which is both different from, yet mirrors that of Angelika's in many ways. Let me begin by saying just a few words about how I approach this topic. As a historian, I'm interested in exploring historical traumas of racial violence. As a psychoanalyst, what is of particular concern to me is the emotional effects of the traumatic histories that have been handed down across generations. For example, how do emotions shape what descendants of the German generation of perpetrators and enablers are able to see, hear, and understand? And in turn, how do we navigate between what is sayable and unsayable, what is seen and unseen, heard and not heard? These are the kinds of questions I believe Angelika addresses. She brings her voice to bear on a topic that still confounds us 80 years on. For as Angelika has demonstrated, violent and traumatic histories don't disappear. They keep reminding us of their presence long after they first occur. As a second-generation German, Angelika grew up in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust. As a child in Canada, she learned at an early age of the challenges and responsibilities a German identification carries. I'm a third-generation German, and likewise spent my childhood in Canada and then in Switzerland. The cultural differences I experienced as a child were magnified by the history I inherited. Angelika describes the difficult process of moving from a position of contending with German history to actually knowing of one's own family involvement in that history. I would argue that this process is at work in both generations, though in different ways. Angelika's book shines a light on our felt experience of history. By felt experience, I refer to a sensed awareness of family history, often inchoate and always present, with which many descendants grow up. Using an autobiographical approach, Angelika gives us a window into what is involved when we engage this felt experience of the past. The process is rarely, if ever, linear. I think of it as a kind of movement between different musical keys. This shifting can be gentle or aggressive, tentative or deliberate, tonal or dissonant, prompted all the while by the need to confront an inherited history that struggles to be known. Whether and to what extent that history is ultimately spoken or heard is never a given. That's one of the reasons that Angelika's book matters. Her willingness to engage the past is not universally shared. Many second and third generation Germans choose to deny, dissociate, or distance themselves from the history they have inherited. Their family's past may be experienced as too formidable, too fear-inducing, or be seen simply as irrelevant. The very question of whether or not to engage the past is also, I believe, one of the many differences that separate the memory work of second and third generation Germans from the traumatic past encountered by descendants of Holocaust survivors. Indeed, any attempt to create an equivalency between these groups of the kind that we see in German narratives of victimization is not only false, it is morally suspect. Germany's collective memory culture is often recognized for its achievements in confronting the Nazi past. But as Angelika reminds us, the felt experience of history within families is qualitatively different from the learned knowledge that is gained through civic education, museum visits, and books. As a result, German family histories often exist in a relationship of tension and conflict with the broader cultural memory discourse. Angelika's book traces the circuitous and often painful path by which her family history comes to light. As Angelika tells it, quote, "I prided myself on my willingness to face the truth, but looking back, I'm not so sure about facing truth. I had read many books that probe the truth of history, but the personal and private truth, the family truth, that was different. I approached it, but with one eye shut. What had people in my family known and done? What sediments of guilt and shame, grief and pain had they lived with? These weren't questions that I pursued with much conviction. I went towards them, but veered off when I got too close," end quote. This process of simultaneous knowing and not knowing is well known to psychoanalysis. It points us in the direction of finding words for that which has remained unsaid. But can those words, once found, also be spoken? Angelika's comment of one eye shut is deeply familiar to me. I learned about the Holocaust from my parents at an early age. They were born in Hanover in 1935 and joined a large wave of young Germans who immigrated in the decades after the war. As immigrants, my parents confronted the challenge of what it meant to be German in post-war Canada. When I was a young child, they shared with me the horrors committed by Nazi Germany and taught me about the obligation to remember. But while one door to the past was opened, another remained shut. Talk of the war in my family, and there was always a lot of it, was about schreckliche Dinge, the terrible things that happened. It was not about responsibility. I knew the stories of my grandfather's participation in the Luftwaffe late in the war of death and destruction. My role was to listen. Questions were not asked. My mother's father was an important figure in my early years, and I longed to see and spend time with him beyond our regular summer trips to Hanover. Whereas one grandfather was present throughout my childhood, the other was absent. My father's father was drafted into the Wehrmacht and died in battle on the Russian front early in 1942. The losses mounted. The house of my mother was destroyed by Allied bombs in 1943, and my father lost his childhood home after his mother defied a local Nazi leader in the town where they lived. These were the stories of my childhood, but I have no comparative memory of ever talking about what my grandparents actually did or believed in relation to the Third Reich. It was as though my family history remained shrouded in shades of gray, never distinct enough to make out the ghostly contours of what might be lurking, waiting to be called out and known. There seemed to be a tacit agreement amongst 3 generations of my family to maintain the accepted narrative, while keeping alternative histories firmly at bay. It was only late in life, as if by chance and circumstance, that I spied an unfamiliar photograph of my young grandfather in uniform and began to learn the full extent of his involvement. That he applied to the Nazi Party in 1936, was inducted a year later, and participated in the NSKK, the so-called car club used by the Nazi regime to indoctrinate middle-class Germans. Historians have recently shown that the NSKK members attended regular lectures on racial ideology, participated in the November pogrom, and even provided support for the mass exterminations in Eastern Europe. There is no ambiguity in this history, no shades of gray. Angelika has described for us her own process of reaching an understanding of her family's past that broke through the filters that had been created. It's not an easy thing to do, and the ramifications of this process within German families can still prove difficult. After glimpsing the photograph of my grandfather, I confronted my mother and we began to converse. It turned out that we'd both been afraid about what might be discovered. Our dialogue began in fits and starts, and eventually felt to me more like an emotional torrent, as my mother shared memories I'd not heard before, nor necessarily wanted to hear. Yet among my mother's siblings, there are some who feel that by revealing my family's history, I've done my grandfather an injustice. I'm no longer welcomed by some family members, even though I've known them since I was a young child. I share this story with you because it illustrates the degree to which emotional conflicts continue to mark family confrontations with the Nazi past. It also points us in the direction of the seemingly simple and straightforward question posed by Angelika's friend at the end of the book, quote, "What made you possibly think that in your family there would be no Nazis?" End quote. As Angelika tells us, there were a host of different reasons why someone became a Nazi, and she adds, quote, "Not every Nazi was a murderer, a monster, an evil person," end quote. In fact, much of the post-war German confrontation with the Nazi past focused on the perpetrators, those who directly committed and supported crimes against humanity. But as Angelika reminds us, the system of perpetration could only function because of the scores of enablers who joined up or willingly looked away. As Angelika writes, quote, "Ordinary people like my Oma Bammer in her nurse's uniform, my Oma Bischoff in her silk jabot, and my Opa Bischoff with his stamp collection," end quote. Just as we have a duty to name the victims, to know who they were, and to tell their stories, I believe that German descendants have a duty to know and to name the enablers, the so-called everyday people who went along with and cheered the regime, at least as long as it worked in their favor. Without the stamp collectors like Angelika's grandfather, or the coin collectors like my grandfather, without each of our grandmothers, the perpetrators could surely not have managed as they did. It is the act of enabling that poses as grave a threat today as it did then. In the end, writes Angelika, perhaps the biggest shock was not discovering Nazis in my family, but realizing how little that fact mattered in itself. What mattered was how that discovery changed my focus. The important question, she writes, was not what would people think if they learned of my Nazi family. The important question was, what did I think from where I now stood? What did it mean to be a human with a history, end quote. I believe that being a human with a family history of the Nazi past links us to that history in a different way. The kind of emotional engagement that follows allows us to grasp the effects of historical traumas into the present and challenges us to address the crises we face today. This points back to what Angelika says about abstraction, which often shapes our discussion and learning about the Holocaust. As Angelika states, quote, "We map the Holocaust in terms of millions, but in a count of 6 million, how do we measure one? 6 Jews deported from Wehlen count more than one. The problem is that we make them numbers, and in so doing, we lose sight of them as persons. We risk dehumanizing them all over again, end quote. Angelika begins to undo that abstraction by researching the members of Wehlen's Jewish community who were deported and murdered to give voice to their experiences. It was a similar impulse that led me to Hanover to meet with and record the experiences of one of the last survivors of Hanover's pre-war Jewish community. She described for me what it was like to grow up as a young German Jewish girl. The fact that she lived a few kilometers from where my mother was also living, and exactly the same time, separated only by a gulf of racial ideology and hatred, made it all the more painful and real. As Angelika shows, the act of researching our own family members and their involvement in the Nazi past breaks down the distance between us and them. It compels us to think differently about our own place in relation to the past. It compels us to respond to the present. The reality of anti-Semitism today, the kinds of prejudice that gave rise to the terrors of the past, cannot be denied. The seeds of racism affect us all. Angelika has written a manifestly important book, and it deserves, indeed it needs, to be read widely. And for that, Angelika, I sincerely thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Angelika, please.
Thank you. I feel like Cordelia in Shakespeare's play. I'm just going to say a very simple thank you, which doesn't even begin to address how deeply grateful I am to both of you for your reflections and comments and moving, thoughtful reading. You know what? I mean, I have so many thoughts, but I'll start with one very, very specific question that is beginning to lead to an answer that I have just been carrying around vaguely now for about, well, since the book was published. When the book was published, I have twins. They're now in their early 30s. And of course, I gave both of them a copy. They both wanted a copy, and they wanted me to, to write my name in it. But the truth is, I don't think they have read it. And I have, when I was writing the book, I had many, many intense discussions about drafts with my son. So it's not that they have been uninterested, but I have wondered, and sometimes with a little bit of a kind of painful disappointment, why are other people reading my book and talking about it? And the people I love most, the people I care about most in the world, are they not interested? And I'm beginning, so I'm coming back. So that's the question. What's beginning to emerge as one possible answer came as I listened to both of your reflections, and it began with Aleida, when you start with Ilse Eichinger, and about the importance of carefully weighing when to remain silent and when to speak, because what is evident the moment we think about it is that both choices are not neutral. Both choices, either choice can be dangerous. Either choice can harm. Either choice can destroy. And the move, or the movement from thinking and feeling to expression, which is what we do when we write, to speaking publicly, each one of those steps is a decisive step into a different kind of response and different kind of responsibility. And I'm thinking about your question, Roger, what is memory work and what forms does it take? And thinking there too, that memory work and the decision to speak, to kind of link those two comments that both of you made, those are fraught decisions that we don't often do voluntarily. You know, that joke that when someone has had something terrible happen to them, you say, well, at least you learned something. Well, and often the joke is, well, I'd rather not have learned it. I'd rather not have learned it. So I'm beginning to think that perhaps one of the reasons my children are not wanting, are kind of keeping their distance, is because this not only is this my memory work, but for them, I could imagine there's a degree of painfulness in seeing someone they love and someone they feel very protective of is exposing and going through. And so I'm thinking now that rather than signify a kind of blasé disinterest, it might in fact be read in a different way. Yeah, so maybe I don't know where we go from here. If we
Thank you to the three of you. You know, some academic panels imperceptibly move from the academic to the poetic in how we think about the past and how this past is connected to us. And I'd like to thank the three of you. It was really an intellectual and human treat to listen to you. So I want us to take some questions, and I'd like to remind our audience to put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom and not at the chat. This would really help us. And yes, Aleida, I can't hear you.
Yeah, perhaps we could also pick up on what Angelika just said, because I think
absolutely
this is really interesting. First of all, this is an amazing process to bring something that was internal out. It's now out there. It's become public. Everybody can deal with it. It is clearly separate and has acquired a new shape. And in this position, of course, it is now also available to her children. And but for them, it is something really different. It's not an externalized object that others can engage with. It is something very, very personal. And I think the Ilse Eichinger quote in German, of course, you cannot do it in English because the word does not exist in English. Schweigen, you know, there is no word for schweigen. It's a verb. You have to use silence and keep or something in order to she really said, manchmal muss man erst schweigen lernen, bevor man sprechen kann. And this idea of schweigen lernen has to do also with timing. And I think just the sheer date of the publication that it is now out is not already a necessity for them to read it. I think that they own it and they have your autograph in it. I think they're both proud that they own this and share this with you. It's part of them now as well. But how they then will approach it, I think that might take a while. And it also has to do with a clear difference between generations. I think each generation has to acquire its own access and find its path and create its relation vis-a-vis the past. So I think there are differences that also have to be respected. And third point is the language. It's always also a question of how to deal with it. How can we discover or create a language? And Eichinger, of course, meant we have to keep silent. And when we listen now, what happens in the trials for those who were not born after, but born right into the Nazi past and were part of it and are now on trial at the age of 100 or 96 years old, they, of course, they don't even have a language. They have never reflected on it. They have not acquired any relationship to it. And therefore, they in a way, they remain mute and or they continue the language that they had always used. So these are all, I think, many different qualifications that are necessary to consider when we talk about transmitting this legacy to the next generation. And my example was Burak Yilmaz, now a young Turkish man in Germany who has found his own access. I mean, he's an absolutely unique story, but again, it shows that it takes some personal courage and it is part of his own life in order to take it up as what I call a secondary witness. And this process is now open, but of course, it needs time.
And, you know, finding that question of finding the right time is so difficult because we're always immersed in the present. No matter which, no matter our willingness or ability to engage with the past, we always, I mean, this is kind of a truism in the field of memory studies that we remember the past, but from the present. But our memories, what another way of putting it is memories of the past, but from the present. And so to the extent that we are immersed in a present always, we may not be able to control that, or we don't control the timing in a way that makes things then come right. So one of the things I realized, and this is a realization that makes the idea of a kind of true working through to the in the sense that one has then kind of cleaned up the unresolved and tangled messes of the past. It doesn't work that way. So, for example, one of the stories I tell in one of the chapters is of a trip to Buchenwald, the Nazi concentration camp of Buchenwald with my mother. And it was at a time in my present when I was unwilling and unable to talk with her. I was filled with resentment. I was filled with anger at her as the embodiment, as the representative, perhaps, of this generation that had done these things that we had witnessed in the way one witnesses atrocity when you visit a site. And my mother wanted to talk, and I refused. I was angry. I was probably feeling self-righteous. I don't even know. I do remember how enraged I was, and how that feeling of despair, and how do we ever bridge this gap, was all that I could muster at the time. And I thought, probably, later, well, some other time. Well, that other time never came. My mother died within a year. She was, a year later, she was diagnosed with cancer. And then before we ever could talk, she was dead. So the attempt to, or the willingness to engage with the past, the willingness to face these monsters, as I kind of called them in my introductory remarks, we're lucky. Sometimes I think we're lucky if we are able to find the right moment. And we're lucky if at the moment when we are able to do something, those with whom we need or want to engage are willing and able also. And often that connection doesn't happen.
And Angelika, maybe I can jump in there. I think the way that I read your book was very much along the lines of what you were just saying, that the past was always in some way present. And then there were these moments where it came into the foreground, that there was something that allowed that to happen. Oftentimes it may have been an interaction that you had, or something you brought to that moment. But even at the same time, what you were just describing, as I understood that part of the book where you visited Buchenwald with your mother, this was a time when it was so difficult to talk with her, and yet there you were visiting a concentration camp. In a sense that it was always there in different levels. And then there's moments when it comes forward and you can actually find the words or hear what might be lurking. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to go back and say one other thing, and that is it also, in connection to what Lida was saying, that your children they've been part of your process, certainly, but they are engaging perhaps in the way that you have as well, that history is there and what will allow them that at different moments to move towards it and to engage with it in the way that you have. And we don't know that in advance.
And yeah. And
can I say something, Angelika?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the reaction of the Turkish person that Alida mentioned, and that your children, let's take them as representative of their generation, the generation of the sons and daughters of you and Roger and others who wrote books and excavated the history of their family. For this Turkish person, learning about the Holocaust and exercising a certain practice of remembrance is a way to become a member of the German collectivity, because he's not a white Christian or Jewish German. Maybe this coming to terms with the past is so much part of German collectivity on one level that you don't need to do it in the same way that your generation had to do it. It doesn't mean that you care less or that you think it's not important. But it means, but it may be that it's there, the work has been done subjectively, that's how you feel, and you can and you can move on, because time also has, the passing of time is also part of what we are speaking about. Or what is the memory practice that we expect of your kids to do? Let's say that you didn't write the book. Of course, there is the personal question. Why didn't they read it as your kids? of course. But let's say that you didn't write a book, or Roger didn't write a book. So what is that we expect them? Just some thoughts.
Well, if I take seriously the implications of what I said a few minutes ago, which is that memories of the past, but in the present, then I think what you're asking, Alan, would mean for each person, each one of us, including my children, but including me now here in Atlanta, to pay attention to the present we're in, and to pay attention to the present we're in with the awareness of how that paying attention is informed by the past that we think we've already dealt with. So, check, done that. But of course, we're never quite done with it. And then there are other pasts, like, again, just to bring up the fact that I'm here in Atlanta. The trial against Ahmad Aubry, who was murdered, is happening now, 2 streets away from where I live, where I walk every day in a beautiful area of Atlanta called Druid Hills. A Black man was murdered without the city reckoning with that or even recognizing that until last year. So last year that was discovered, and this was exposed, and discussions are happening. A marker has been put up, kind of not the stumbling stones, but a marker by the street. So the past shifts. It's not just one past. And maybe this is, Aleida, where the example that you gave of a matter of honor fighting anti-Semitism is so perfect, because the past is both the past that we kind of carry with us wherever we go, but it's also the past that we then step into. And how to pay attention to that and make decisions and choices based on that, I think that's the mandate.
I'd like to give our audience, Aleida, just a second, because the 4 of us can go on for hours. And I want to let our audience give them the opportunity to ask at least a few questions. So we have a question from Stephen Klingman to you, Angelika. What you may have wanted from your father in that account of indirection you read from, some self-knowledge on his part, on your part, a confession of some kind? If there is such a thing as secondary witness, is there such a thing as secondary confession? He also wonders about the distinction between perpetrators and enablers, the so-called cheerleaders. Isn't there a third category, neither overt perpetrators nor cheerleaders, but those who just go along? And he thinks about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. That's the framework for his thought, but this is another story, he says.
Yeah, to the question about my father, I don't think it would be really honest for me to now say what I expected of him, what I would have wanted from him. I think really honestly, the way he responded was what it was probably all that I could at that moment expect. I'll maybe pivot a little bit to another dimension of my reaction, which is what that moment and moments like it, what that creates for me is a different challenge, which is how to love people in the face of their obvious flaws, imperfect, and I don't mean just the way we know that any one of us, we have flaws and imperfections, but how to cross the breach of this enormous, of the magnitude of this history, that often felt as if my father was on one side of a chasm, and I was, because of just the accident of our times, of our birth, I was on the other side. How do we bridge that? And in that moment, that chasm opened up. And yet I loved him. And that helplessness of his response made my love more complicated, but it didn't undo it. And I don't know that if he had responded differently, I would have, maybe I would have had a cooler father to write about. I would have said, oh, I have, I had the father I had, and that was my challenge. And that was the relationship that we had to both come to terms with. And he had a daughter that maybe he also had to come to terms with, a daughter who asked questions that weren't comfortable. A daughter who made him feel, who confronted him with things that he didn't want to confront. About the enablers and bystanders, I don't know, Roger, do you want to take that? Or Alida?
I can answer that briefly to the extent I can. I think enablers is a term that is more recent and perhaps allows us to speak to what used to often be referred to in English as bystanders. But having a simple duality of bystanders and perpetrators really leaves a massive area in the middle, as it were, of individuals who weren't just bystanding, they were actually quite actively supportive of the perpetrators. And I think, as Angelika says, there are so many different ways in which one could, during that period, be a Nazi, and in fact was a Nazi, that we have to be careful with generalizations. And here I'm probably speaking directly to my own family and my own grandfather when I used the term enabler. Perpetrator being someone who is directly involved in committing crimes against humanity. That's one way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
I found it very interesting that in your conversation that you read with your father, he draws a clear line between the war and the Holocaust. And that is a kind of protection shield. Now you have two different sides. Things are going on here, and the war protected him. This amazing sentence: the war protected me from becoming a perpetrator or whatever. Now we know about the war, and you write about it very, very clearly. And you mentioned the Operation Barbarossa, and it goes into Eastern Europe. And it goes into Russia, and it goes into Leningrad, into St. Petersburg, and it's the Leningrad blockade. And it is, of course, a huge war crime that is being done there. And there is no reflection in this generation of all these people who were drafted, and they had to go, they were drafted, they were part of it, and they were part of this massive crime against humanity, which the blockade is. And I was in Leningrad. I had a conference with Russians on this thing and on this event, and went also to a cemetery there. And to be there and to learn about it also from a fantastic Russian writer who was the first to carry out kind of oral history research among those survivors of the blockade. Once you have exposed yourself to this, of course, the whole story changes again. You know, there are, this is not just one abyss, there are many abysses that you can look into, but what is really also important about this event of learning is that you form very meaningful relations with the people who tell you about it. So if you find people who are able to tell you about it, for them it is very meaningful, and for you yourself as well. So I think that is something that memory work can also entail, not just doing it for yourself as a rather solitary process, but also in terms of sharing stories with others. And from that point of view, I think it's something that definitely has to become part of German memory culture, the Leningrad blockade, and the almost 1 million people who died of hunger there, and the scar that's still in the Russian population is extremely present.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say another thought, and then maybe I will let you each say some concluding remarks, and we'll end because it's getting late. Sometimes I think that to atone for a collective past is more difficult than to atone for a personal past, although it's paradoxical. But I think Angelika's father responded in the way that one might expect. It's very difficult to atone for this past, to put yourself. It's also not so clear how to put yourself. I mean, we are scholars, we have all the terms, bystanders, perpetrators, second degree, but it's also worthwhile remembering that it's within the lifetime of this generation in Germany that things have changed. We are 100 years after, more than 150 years after slavery in America. And just a few weeks ago in the election campaign in Virginia, the Republican Party proposed to take Toni Morrison's Beloved out of the school curriculum because one mother said that her child was offended. So this is many generations after slavery. So I don't want to. My point is not to exonerate Angelika's father, but simply to say that the relationship between past and present and how perceptions of the past change in society is a process that sometimes can surprise also us, and there is no one prescription on how to do it. And Germany, for many of us, remain a success story.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we go in the order that you spoke? You can say a few words for not concluding words. There are no concluding words here. There are simply some more words to say.
Well, shall I start then?
Yes.
I'll just start with a couple of thoughts about the concept of memory work. And a few things come to mind. One is when Freud talks about memory work, Erinnerungsarbeit, it is inseparable from Trauerarbeit, which is grief or mourning work. That's something that gets lost in the English. So that in and of itself might be one very simple initial answer to why one doesn't willingly and happily and readily and easily just do this. It's difficult because it involves grief, and we don't voluntarily step into grief. So Freud says the first step in the process of working through is the courage to admit that something is wrong. That's step number one. And everything unfolds from that. But the other part that he emphasizes over and over again is that you can't do it alone. As I'm thinking about your comment now, Alon, about collective, kind of atoning for collective crimes, I'm thinking that also the process of, it's not just the collective nature of the thing that was committed, but the collective nature of the process of responding to it, which is integral to the process, at least psychoanalytically speaking, the way Freud lays it out, of coming to terms, to use that German word, to coming to terms with what we carry with us. And it takes courage, and we can't do it alone. So in that sense, maybe I'll conclude just by thanking all of you for enabling us to do something together, not alone, and to engage in this dialogue together.
Aleida?
Yeah. Again, Angelika, I would like to stress what I find really fascinating, not only about the book, but all the years behind the book as well, that this has become the issue of your lifetime. And it started so early on. So you are a very special case here. And within your family, you had, even though your parents didn't give you any hints or clues or framework in which to develop all these questions, out of the blue, you raise all of this. This for me is phenomenal. It's something really amazing. And it's also the scene in the school class, nobody is interested in this. And you try to amass all this material and to present them and to bring it into a focus and to utter it and speak about it in this time of silence. So this for me is extremely unique. And then you separate yourself from this collective of Germans, and you take it with you and you develop it, and now it's a book. And I think the book is really helpful, and I wonder why it is in English. It should be in German, because it is a wonderful way for Germans to enter your path and to follow you there, because what you help and offer them, you have something great to offer. It's to expose themselves, the willingness to exposure, and then to learn in detail, to really become interested. The more you learn, the more you get interested. And then also to feel what you learn, to combine the learning with the feeling. And I think this process is now something that is something that you can get together with the book. And I hope for many, many readers of it, and I can imagine many readers who will be equally thankful as I was.
Angelika, I want also just to thank you, and I think just to emphasize the experiential aspect of the book, because that's really how I find that it communicates to the reader. You bring the reader into your process of seeking to address this enormously difficult and challenging past. And you also leave the reader with a sense, I think importantly, that it's not a past that can be resolved. There is no resolution per se. It is an ongoing process. And I think that's absolutely key, because so oftentimes there's this desire to have this wrapped up and to move on. And with that ongoing process in mind, I think back to the question you posed right at the start about your children and their own process with this, right? As when we begin a conversation, we don't know where it will end. We don't know what direction it will take, rather. And it will be interesting to see where your children take this, where the next generation takes this conversation, because surely they will. They've grown up with it. It's part of the history they've inherited. So thank you.
Angelika, Aleida, and Roger, we are all indebted to you. Thank you for this great conversation, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Goodbye, Alida. Goodbye, Roger.
Goodbye. I say even good night. You see my windows, they're pitch
Yes,
black.
good night. It's dark back
Good
there.
night. Have a
Yeah.
nice afternoon.
Roger, hope to see you maybe in Berlin, maybe here. We'll see. And Alan, thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. It was really wonderful to have a chance to talk, and Lida to have a chance to meet you as well.
Likewise, Roger. Bye.
Bye-bye.